you want to talk from there?
Sure, yeah, I prefer to talk from here. See everything. Well, thank you very much, and I'm quite looking forward to our discussions today because for myself, at least personally, we're going to hopefully be exploring aspects of development finance that I haven't spent a lot of time looking at, so I look forward to learning from the process that we have underway today and from the contributions of the others here in the room that have been following these in much more depth. What I'm going to do is, as was said, give a brief overview of the different aspects of development finance. And perhaps you could put up the first slide. And in the beginning, it may seem that I'm on a tangent, but I wanted to explore a little bit of the implications of the title and what is actually implied by Beyond Aid. And I guess I would come to the point of view that perhaps Beyond Aid is, I would actually call it a dangerous concept in the sense that what we're talking about is development resources for poverty eradication. So I'll explore a little bit about that, and then I'll go on to basically walk us through different aspects of trends in official development assistance, and then look briefly at the other aspects of global development finance. And I just at the beginning, it's in the last slide, so you have a reference to it on your table, but I'm going to draw a lot from this very impressive study that was done earlier this year by Development Initiatives in the UK called Investments to End Poverty, that was launched in September at the special session of the UN General Assembly. And so not only does this do in a much better way what I'm intending to do here, it's actually written in a very easy to understand language in terms of explanations of some of the more technical aspects of development finance. So I would highly recommend this publication, and I'm indebted to it in terms of what I'm going to say to you. So first slide. So as I said, I think we have to have an understanding of some of the trends in poverty if we're going to understand the implications of development finance for the eradication of poverty. And while quite rightly there has been a considerable focus, certainly since the MDGs, on extreme poverty, that is defined as those living on less than $1.25 purchasing power a day, I would argue that while this is very important to pay attention to, that is not the full dimensions of poverty as experienced by people in developing countries. And so what I've done here in the next couple of slides is look at several different definitions of poverty. So the green in this slide is extreme poverty. And then, as I say, that's defined as basically the basics of existence. So it's $500 a year of income. The next is $2 a day, which $730 a year of income. And this was arrived at as kind of the median poverty line among a sample of developing countries. So this still is very much what is some people call moderately poor. And so I would say that this is a very important segment of the population that we have to consider when we're looking at development resources. And as you can see, while extreme poverty is 21% for all developing countries, if you consider $2 a day, it bounces to 41%. And then there's another category that these are all taken from the World Bank statistics, so they're all measured by the World Bank, is $4 a day. And this, by some people, is considered the near poor. So these are people who largely are living in the informal sector and probably are highly vulnerable to slipping back into poverty, into either a $2 a day level of poverty or even $1.25 a day. So if you combine all of that, you're looking at more than 2/3 of the current population of developing countries are either living in poverty or near poverty. And I think we have to keep this in mind when we talk about how to say the resources to end poverty. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, for $4 a day, you're looking at more than 90% of the populations. So to argue that, and I would argue that certainly we made a lot of progress over the last decades in reducing all levels of poverty, not only just extreme poverty, but you'll see in a minute the others as well, that we still face a global crisis in poverty, and that we need to talk about resources in that context, not just as financial flows, is I guess the main point I would make. So next slide, I'll go through the next one fairly quickly because I basically said all I want to say on this, but here you see $1.25 a day, so you see that it's important to point out that China is a big factor here. And you see in China between 2002 to 2010, in China, extreme poverty has declined from 28% of the population to 12% of the population. And given the population of China, this is a very significant number of people. Go on the next slide, $2 a day. There's still a considerable number of people in China living on $2 a day, which is still moderately poor, 27% of the population. Again, it's declined significantly, though, from 51%. So China is a very big factor in the statistics around trends in global poverty, and I think it needs to be recognized as such. And so in looking at other continents, and the ones that I have here, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, you see trends that are not nearly as dramatic as what you see in China. On $4 a day, as I said, the trend again is down in China, down in all developing countries. But if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, the trend there is a very modest decline, both in percentages, but also in numbers. So I should have another slide here, which I was going to do, but then kind of ran out of time. And partly, but also because I want to talk about flows, and that is around trends in inequality. Because I think that is the other dimension of what we're talking about here, where who is capturing the resources for development. And I think many of you in this room know that the trends around inequality have dramatically increased in terms of the gap between the poor and the rich in many countries, not least China. I was just in China, and I've never seen so many Mercedes in my whole life. That is if you can see them through the pollution. So I want to go through some of the trends now, and the first one is ODA, Official Development Assistance. And this is a global, we're talking about global trends, so these are all DAC donors, all Development Assistance Committee donors. And this trend here is what I call real ODA. So this is a term that was invented by the Reality of Aid. It's subsequently been taken up in a slightly different form by the Development Assistance Committee. But this is aid minus what donors can count for students studying in Canada, minus what donors can count for refugees for their first year in Canada, and minus debt relief that also can be counted. So this is more or less the resources that are available for transfer to developing countries. There's a lot of nuance on that, but it's not important for the purposes of our discussion here. But you can see from this trend, and this is in real dollars, so this is taking account inflation, these are 2011 dollars, that ODA has increased quite significantly since 2000. So from 77.5 billion to 119.4 billion. So that's a very significant increase, almost 2/3 it's grown by. It has declined, as has been profiled many times in the last few years, from a high of 126.9 billion to its current level in 2012 at 119. And that decline is significant. It's 5-6%, but still we have a considerable resource globally for ODA. And while we would, as I would, encourage all donors to increase the amounts of aid, I think, as we've been discussing in the last 5 years, many of the issues around aid is in its actual use. And the reason I perhaps shudder a bit at the notion of beyond aid is that aid is actually the only resource that, in principle, can be directly programmed to deal with poverty eradication. And so, I think it is still a very, very important resource from that point of view. And we will discuss perhaps in our subsequent sessions the degree to which other resources are actually programmed or determined in a way that speak more directly to poverty eradication. So looking a little bit more at some of the trends in ODA, I think some of these have been positive as well as the increase. So the value of ODA going to low-income countries, which is the black line there, has increased by 135% over this since 2000. The value of ODA going to lower middle-income countries. These are countries. I don't have the number here, but it's in terms of per capita income. I can't remember actually. It's about 1,500 to another range. About 1,200, yeah. And so lower middle-income countries are countries that still are facing considerable resource constraints, domestic resource constraints, as well as resources available for poverty eradication from all sources. So it's a very important category, I think, to look at in terms of where we should direct our ODA. And then the value of ODA to upper middle income countries has increased very modestly. But if you look at the trend in terms of the share of ODA going to these different categories of countries over this period, for low-income countries, aid has actually increased by 16%, but it's actually declined as a share for lower middle-income countries declined by 7% and declined by 10% for upper middle-income countries. In terms of our discussion today, where many of the alternative resource flows are more directed to certainly upper middle income countries, but also to a degree to lower middle income countries, this trend in aid shows that aid is still a very crucial resource for many countries in the world that are experiencing extreme levels of poverty. Next slide. Here I'm looking at the geographic shift, and I'll just point out two things. One is you'll see these are time periods, so the blue is 95-96, the red, whatever the color that is 99-2000, green is 2005-06, and the black is 2009-10. So for sub-Saharan Africa, you've seen sub-Saharan Africa take an increasingly large share of total ODA, 44% in 2010. There's also been increases for South and Central Asia, but I point out that most of that is driven by increases in recent years to Afghanistan. So if you looked at other countries in that category, you would see even perhaps declines for some countries. For other Asia, that's Eastern Asia and Oceania, there's been a very steep decline in the share there, and that's partly driven, I think, by China and a number of countries that have moved into even the upper middle income category. The Middle East, you see the big bump there in 2005. That's really Iraq, where there was large transfers by donors to Iraq. And then the last thing I want to say about ODA is around who are the major donors. And if you look at bilateral aid, that's aid that's transferred directly by donor countries, not including the money that they transfer to multilateral institutions. Really, 5 donors dominate the scene. So France, Germany, Japan, UK, and the US. And their share in total ODA has grown. So from 1990, when it was about 65% of total ODA transfers, bilateral ODA transfers. It's now a little over 70%. So it's really these countries plus the EU, and the orange there, red, is the EU institutions. They are in some ways included in the black because they include France and Germany. They also have become a very, very significant player over these years in determining the directions for ODA and how ODA is used. So I think this is also a very important thing to keep in mind as we talk about transforming the aid system to one that is more effective and one that addresses poverty. And it's,
Ryan, does that include the shares through IDA?
no, it's bilateral. Okay, the next slide is, I think, one of the more interesting ones for me that came from this publication. And what they did was they calculated for every country the per capita government spending. So this is the total spending per person in each country. And then they looked at where poor people live. And they combined those two things, and they came up with some very interesting numbers. So this slide only looks at people living in poverty at $1.25 a day. You could do the other, but it would take you a couple of days of kind of number crunching. They don't do it, so I didn't really have time to do it. You could do it for the other categories of poverty that I mentioned. So they demonstrate that of the total numbers of people, less than 1 billion people living on $1.25 a day, 106 million people live in countries where government spending is less than, per person, is less than $200. So, and this is annual spending. So the government is only spending $200 per person in a country where 106 million people still live in poverty. Countries that spend between $200 and $500, there's about 270 million people live on $1.25 a day in those countries. And then 500 to 1,000, another 575. So basically, what this demonstrates is that among those living in extreme poverty, almost all of them live in countries that have to spend in all their revenue less than $1,000 a day per person. And you can go through and you can dig up these numbers, and they're varied around what kind of the WHO would calculate as a minimum that should be spent on health per day per person by government, the same with education. And you add all that up along with what is quite legitimate government expenditures around security, around income security, around the basic services that government should provide. You see why it's very difficult for countries on their own to actually be able to be effective in meeting what I would say their human rights obligations to provide adequate housing, healthcare, and education, etc. So I think that this is, I think, quite useful also for our discussions here when we begin to talk about what is the opportunity, and there is, I think, around domestic resource mobilization for poverty eradication. And China, a country that has made a lot of progress in poverty, has effectively moved over the last decade from spending in the category of 500 to 1,000 per person to above 2,000. And this is in part why China has been successful in eradicating poverty, because it's actually invested government resources in meeting these obligations. So I wanted to spend a little time on that slide. So now I'm going to go through very quickly some of the other resource flows. These are estimates. All of what I've been talking about so far is DAC donors. So European, North American, Australian, Japan, etc. This is numbers that we have been able to estimate for other aid providers. They do not wish to be called donors, so we suggest that they're aid providers. They do not report their aid or their resource flows as aid, so it has to be an estimate if you want to compare it to what comes from DAC countries. So these are estimates, but the best estimate is about $17 billion from these sources, and the main ones here are China, and there's debate about the level in China. My number comes from UNDP China, who recently, in the last few months, did a study with the Department of Commerce in China that is managing China's aid program. So I think it's a fairly accurate number. It's 4.3 billion, almost, not quite, but almost the size of Canada's aid program. And this is just aid. This is not, what China does in terms of supporting its investments on a commercial basis. This is the equivalent of what we would call aid. Saudi Arabia, another big one at $5 billion, and then interestingly Turkey, which has grown quite significantly at $2.5 billion and is growing each year. And we can, I've just completed a study with UNDP China that is looking in much more depth at this from a civil society point of view and the degree to which civil society is actually engaged in these programs. And we can talk about that outside the course of this meeting because it's not directly relevant. But these flows are very significant and we must take them into account. The next slide is on other official flows. So these are flows that come from government, but government donors cannot count them as ODA because they don't meet the criteria that the DAC has established for ODA. And so the climate finance, which actually is counted as ODA by many donors, but it's already captured in the ODA figures that I mentioned before. Military, other non-security, innovative finance, something mentioned earlier, a relatively small number right now at 1.2 billion, but likely also captured for the most part in existing ODA figures. Development finance institutions, these are essentially European institutions that use small amounts of aid resources to catalyze private resource flows. And so they are about the order of $37 billion. We don't, or I couldn't find any figures on the return on those loans to see what the balance that's actually coming back. Other official flows, these are export credits, like the EDC in Canada, $79 billion, but in terms of repayments in this year, 2011, there was $53 billion that came back, so a relatively small net amount. So when you net all that out, approximately you have about $78 billion of non-official flows. Large part, these are supporting commercial endeavors in the developing countries. Not necessarily, but not also necessarily true that they are not contributing to the diminution of poverty. But certainly the studies, for example, of the European development finance institutions has demonstrated quite clearly that this has not been the primary objective of much, even though it's the stated one, it's not in practice the primary outcome, I guess to say, of many of these resource flows. And then you come to commercial flows, and this is foreign direct investment, 470 billion in 2011, but a return in terms of profit remittances of 419 billion. Now that's, in this case, doesn't make a comment on the importance of foreign direct investment. One can have foreign direct investment that is serving development purposes in developing countries and still have a net return to the investor in terms of profit remittances. So I'm not making a comment here that because 419 billion comes back, that necessarily this is a bad investment. But when we're talking about flows, you have to talk about flows to and flows from. And then you have various other categories there that I'm not going to go into in detail, but and I'm sure this is going to be talked about much more. The illicit flows at the bottom there, $645 billion from transnational corporations, trade and trade mispricing, and then 170 of other illicit flows. So I'm sure we'll hear more about that this afternoon or maybe later this morning. And then finally, private flows. So this is many of us in the room here. This is flows that are raised by charitable organizations, private organizations around the world. And these again are estimates. It's very hard to pin down numbers here. If you go by the DAC, who ask each donor to estimate how much money is raised by Canadian NGOs and report that, you find a very low estimate, in my view. It's $31 billion in 2011. But the Center for Global Philanthropy in the U.S. has done a number of studies, and for example, in Japan, Japan reports $467 million to the DAC, but this study demonstrated that $5.5 billion is actually raised by Japanese organizations for developing countries. So we know that the DAC estimate is very low. The best that we can come up with is probably about $60 billion, which is based on the research that's done by this Global Center for Philanthropy. So $60 billion is quite a considerable amount, and if you compare that, the DAC has made a calculation, what they call programmable aid, which is real aid minus a few other things, and it is really money that is very directly available to developing country governments to program, and they come with a total of $70 billion for 2010. And so you could say that NGOs around the world are actually contributing an equal amount to developing countries. So quite considerable flows. And then you have others of private foundations, total private sector flows. This is the private sector itself, and I think 8.2 billion, but it's important to point out that a large part of this is in kind, so it's pharmaceutical companies donating pharmaceutical goods and services along those lines. Not that it's not unimportant, but it's different than a financial flow. And then this is not in your slides because I had basically forgotten to put it in, but I did last night. Remittances. Very, very important and considerable flow of $210 billion and made up of about $190 billion coming from DAC countries. But interestingly, the study calculated that in the BRIC countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China, there's $14 billion in remittances from those countries to other developing countries. So again, quite considerable. But at least one half of these remittances in Latin America, for example, go to Mexico. Half of the remittances in Asia go to China and India. And so, I think we have to look at not only the purposes of the remittances, which I think is quite an interesting but a lengty discussion, but also in terms of resource flows that we're talking about here, where these remittances are actually going. And that's something that we can explore perhaps a bit more, either outside this meeting or later. So I'm going to end there. I've probably gone over my time, but I hope this gives you a sense of kind of the flows that we are talking about in terms of transfers from mainly developed countries to developing countries.
Thank you, Brian.